Oh, hi there, welcome to TAS Film and TV Reviews. This is my retrospective review of Martin Scorsese's 1991 film Cape Fear, starring Robert De Niro and Nick Nolte. And I recently rewatched the movie because Apple TV has just started showing a TV drama adaptation, which I'm going to be watching shortly. And Scorsese's 1991 film is actually a remake of the 1962 TV miniseries of the same name, starring Robert Mitchum and Gregory Peck. And both the 90s film and the 60s TV show are based on the 1957 novel The Executioners by John D. MacDonald. And I'm going to start this review by saying that a combination of De Niro and Scorsese is as close as you're going to get to a slam dunk in filmmaking. That's been proven over many decades now. But for the reasons I'm going to set out here, I actually think it's a rare miss for both of them on its own terms, this film. And it was made in 1991, which despite me thinking was about 15 years ago, is actually 35 years ago now. And for my money, it hasn't aged very well either. So there's a few different areas where I feel that the film falls down, which I'm going to look at in turn. And broadly speaking, my criticisms of the film are as follows. So we've got the general themes and ideas explored within the movie, 1. The performances, 2. And then the screenplay and cinematography, 3. And of course, looking at this film now, it's 35 years old. So I need to be mindful of my own biases here. I'm watching this now with the benefit of 35 years of film watching knowledge. I'm also watching it now with the benefit of having experienced 35 more years of popular culture in general. And of course, as a popular culture artifact, the film is actually legendary in some respects. But rewatching it now, all I can think of is that Simpsons episode with Sideshow Bob. And I'm really not sure that's a good thing. I really think there's a good argument to be made that for a certain generation of people, that Simpsons episode is actually more memorable and iconic than the actual film. So as I touched on, in terms of the themes and ideas explored, for me there's a series of questions that this film poses which on second watching felt both rushed and also glossed over. So for example, Scorsese builds the film around this moral ambiguity about whether it's okay to take the law into your own hands if it's in the greater good, and then what the consequences of that might be. So Nick Nolte's character Sam Bowden here, he's a lawyer, and so we have that exploration within the film of who holds the power in society and who gets to do what with it. So in this instance, we know that Sam made a moral judgment about De Niro's Cady's character when he was defending him in court, which subsequently led Cady to spend 14 years behind bars. But Scorsese here, he also paints Sam himself as morally lacking, and that opens up a great deal of space for exploration within the film. And I suppose we get a sort of postmodern analysis here with questions on who in society gets to decide what is true, and then we get some brief analysis on whether those same people are actually morally superior and what that tells us about society more generally. And then there's also a religious component to it. So I guess here, we're thinking about retribution, an eye for an eye, and what's justified in terms of revenge or retribution, and then who gets to decide what is and isn't justifiable. But for me, there isn't really any deep exploration of that, other than references to Max Cady's tattoos or some of his set-piece speeches. And then we also have questions about class and social strata here. There are repeated references to De Niro's Cady being white trash, a hillbilly, or a cracker, but that isn't explored here in the same way as Rambo, to give an example from around the same time, because that film, held a light up to suburban America's disdain for their war heroes, and it really explored, class divisions in American society. But the overall feeling here is that these are all themes and ideas which never really seem to get off the ground floor. And I know Scorsese's only got 2 hours here, but it all feels sort of glossed over and rushed, and lost in amongst the actual drama of Cady terrorising the family. And then in terms of the screenplay and cinematography, I know it's not always helpful to compare, but if you do compare this to something like Michael Mann's 1986 movie Manhunter, or even David Fincher's Seven, which came out about 4 years later than this, it looks whimsical and dated somehow. Think about the portrayals of evil, sociopathy, or just cold hard revenge put onto screen. What are the films that come to your mind? I'm thinking of films like No Country for Old Men, or Manhunter, or even Heath Ledger's Joker character. Each of those films that I just mentioned is in a different era, but each has that sort of sense of menace and threat that just jumps off the screen. And I really don't get that from this film. And then linked to that, it's also weirdly lacking in suspense, despite that being its sort of stock in trade. And I think that's down to the fact that there's almost a slapstick element to this in parts. Whether that's the weird dream sequences, the sort of experimental close-ups and strange camera angles, the overacting, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, or the scenes of violence and threat being graphic at times, but then also quite weak. It all contributes to that sort of overall feeling of being quite vanilla. And then I also don't really get any sense of place either. Where the Bowdens live is never really shown in any detail. It's not a feature of the drama really. And even when they do travel to Cape Fear in the final act, the journey doesn't give anything away about where they're going and what it's like there. It's the title of the drama, so I want some sense of what this place is other than just a name. Think of The Shining, where you get those sweeping panoramic shots of the woods and the mountainside, which give a sense of isolation and wilderness to the Overlook Hotel. There's none of that here. And then that in turn makes the ending of the film on the water seem weirdly at odds with the rest of the film. I've not read the 1957 novel The Executioners, but I gather the ending on the water was added in the 1962 TV drama, because in the book the climax actually happens at the family home. And so in this version, which Scorsese keeps from the 1962 drama, we don't really get any sense of why we're on the water. We don't get any idea that there's any real purpose to this, or that we've been building up to this as a place. So, I get the idea that the family are running away to a place of perceived safety, away from civilization, somewhere where Cady won't be able to track them down. But I never really get the point of why there. Why not some other place? And so for me, the final act, it really just comes across as a set piece without any meaning in the context of the wider film. And it actually makes the payoff at the end of the movie feel quite hollow. We could just as easily have been at a cabin in the woods, which of course we've seen on screen 100 times before. And then in terms of the performances here, I touched on it above, but think about portrayals of evil, sociopathy or menace put onto screen. Who and what comes to mind? So I'm thinking about Javier Bardem as Anton Chigurh. I'm thinking James Gandolfini as Tony Soprano, Heath Ledger as the Joker, or Brian Cox as Hannibal Lecter. Each of those actors brought their own interpretation of evil and menace to the character within the context of the story that they lived within. And they then took their respective film or TV show to the next level because of that. And for me, De Niro's portrayal of Max Cady here doesn't really cut the mustard in the context of those performances that I've just mentioned. Now, of course, it's not for me, just a guy off the internet, to criticise Robert De Niro. He's possibly the finest actor of his generation and one of the best actors in history. And, perhaps he was directed to overact or to really ham it up here. But his performance is just too much for me. I mentioned it a bit earlier. It's almost slapstick in parts. The fake laugh, the exaggerated facial expressions, the Hawaiian shirts and the oversized cigars. It just feels too ostentatious, too showy and too much really. And then Nick Nolte as the other main character doesn't really pass muster here either. For me, there was no real distinguishing features to his performance. It's fine, but it's nothing more than that. And so when you've got your two main protagonists not really pulling up trees, you're always going to be onto a loser. But having said all that, the counterpoint to that is Juliette Lewis. Her performance here was really good. And the one scene where I really felt a looming sense of dread was when Cady corners Juliette Lewis's character in the drama studio. And Juliette Lewis, she really plays that naive schoolgirl well. And there's that dangerous sort of sexual tension that exists between her and Cady. And it becomes real for the audience because we've all been young. We know that thrill when someone pays you attention. But yet we as the audience, we know he's a brutal rapist. So it was the one time in the movie where I really felt uncomfortable and got a sense of dread. And I think in large part that's because the threat here is implied. And De Niro actually dials it back in that scene, which makes it more effective. So in view of all of that, it's like the film, it can't really decide what it wants to be. It can't decide whether it's a contemplative exploration of society's legal and moral codes. Is it a psychological thriller? Is it a horror slasher type film? Or is it a crime procedural drama? And I think it gets mixed up in what it's trying to achieve. And it ends up falling down for that reason. So I'm going to put this one more in Scorsese's Shutter Island collection, perhaps, rather than, with Raging Bull or Casino. Yeah, it's decent enough, but it's not in his top tier, certainly. But having watched this again, I think it's really clear that the subject matter here lends itself to the longer format of a TV drama series. So I think in a TV drama series, you're going to get more scope to explore the relationships. There'll be more scope to build the suspense, more scope to explore that moral complexity, and then also more scope to develop a sense of place. So what I really hope from this new Apple TV drama is that the filmmakers just pick a lane and really go for it. So, whether that's the moral angle, whether it's the hunter and the hunted storyline, or whether they go for gore and horror. Whatever they choose, I want it to be an A-star portrayal on the screen. So, despite all my misgivings and my sort of critique of Scorsese's Cape Fear, I'm absolutely pumped for this new drama on Apple TV. It looks amazing from what I've seen in the trailers, and the early reviews look great as well. And of course, there's loads of interesting source material to work with. So I'm really excited to see how they approach it and what they do with it. And of course, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.